Dead forests still smoldering with radioactive smoke, laboratories abandoned with anthrax and plague rotting in the dirt, fire trucks, tanks, and helicopters from a nuclear meltdown sit rusting in the ground, and massive concrete domes meant to trap radioactive waste now crack under rising seas, spilling poison into the ocean. These are disturbing discoveries found inside government exclusion zones. Back in 1986, the Chernobyl meltdown blasted the nearby pine forest with so much radiation that the needles turned bright red and the trees died off in days. And that's where the name comes from, the Red Forest. This 10 square kilometer stretch, part of the bigger exclusion zone straddling Ukraine and Belarus, still holds onto those dead trees and leaves pretty much intact even after 40 years. Normal decay happens because microbes and fungi break down organic matter, but radiation levels here wiped out most of those decomposers or messed with their DNA so bad it just can't function right. Walk through it today and you'll see piles of 1986 needles that look fresh just sitting there on the ground. The real problem hits during dry summers when wildfires spark up, and they do pretty regularly. In 2020 alone, fires burned over 8,600 hectares in the zone, kicking up plumes of smoke loaded with leftover radioactive particles, which then traveled hundreds of kilometers and dropped back down with rain, spreading contamination to places like Kiev and other parts of Europe. Monitoring stations picked up spikes as far as Sweden during those fires. From 1949 to 1989, the Soviet Union used a stretch of Kazakhstan as its primary nuclear testing ground, the Semipalatinsk test site. Locals called it the Polygon. Over those 40 years, 456 nuclear weapons were detonated there. Some underground, many atmospheric, especially early on. The uncomfortable part is that villages were sitting right in the fallout paths. More than 1 million people lived in the surrounding area during those decades, and for years nobody evacuated them, even though fallout was drifting across farms. Animals grazed on contaminated grass. Kids were outside during detonations that shook windows miles away. By the late 80s, Kazakh researchers were publishing data showing elevated cancer rates, especially thyroid cancer and leukemia. Reports also documented higher rates of birth defects compared to non-exposed areas. The site covers around 18,500 square kilometers. Some areas still test positive for plutonium contamination today. Kazakhstan officially shut it down in 1991. In October 1952, Britain wanted to know what would happen if a nuclear bomb went off inside a ship in a harbor, so they staged it. They anchored an old ship, HMS Plim, off the Montebello Islands in Western Australia, placed a 25 kiloton plutonium device inside the hull, and detonated it. The ship didn't survive in any recognizable form. Steel was vaporized, other sections twisted and fused into these strange glassy fragments that scattered across the seabed and nearby islands. Divers later documented debris fields in the lagoon. Cleanup operations in the 90s removed larger pieces, but not everything. There's still plutonium contamination. Access to parts of the islands are restricted. Visitors are warned not to pick up metal fragments that they might find. How long will it take to go away? Well, plutonium-239 has a half-life of about 24,000 years, so whatever is still there, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. In the 50s and early 60s, Britain carried out 7 major nuclear tests at Maralinga in South Australia, along with hundreds of smaller trials. But one of the most disturbing events actually happened earlier in 1953 during the Operation Totem tests. That was a 9 kiloton detonation. The fallout plume didn't behave the way planners expected though. It drifted straight over Aboriginal communities. People later described a strange black mist rolling in after the blast. It burned their eyes, made them vomit, skin blistered. A man named Yemi Lester, who was a child at the time, said he went blind after being caught in that fallout. He spent decades campaigning for recognition of what happened. A royal commission in 1985 found that safety procedures were very flawed, and that the indigenous people living nearby were not properly warned or protected. Some families unknowingly camped in contaminated craters afterward. Animals were hunted and eaten from areas where stuff had settled into the soil. Cleanup didn't begin seriously until the 90s. Contaminated soil was scraped up and buried, but plutonium particles were scattered across wide areas. Even today, some zones are still restricted. During World War II, Britain wanted to test biological weapons, so between 1942 and 1943, they chose a small island off the coast of Scotland called Gruinard. They tethered sheep to stakes and detonated explosives packed with anthrax spores. The test proved the weapon worked. The problem was the spores stayed. Anthrax can survive in soil for decades under the right conditions. After the test, the island was declared off limits. In 1981, activists from a group calling themselves the Dark Harvest Commandos secretly landed there. They collected soil samples and sent them to labs. The spores were still viable nearly 40 years later. That stunt forced the government to finally take action, and from 1983 to 1986, crews soaked the topsoil in a formaldehyde solution and removed the heavily contaminated layers. Afterwards, sheep were reintroduced as a test, and these ones survived, so the island was officially declared safe in 1990. Safe. In the middle of what used to be the Aral Sea sat Vozdrozhdenia Island. During the Cold War, it housed the Soviet Union's Aralsk 7 bioweapons facility. From the 50s until 1992, they tested pathogens like anthrax, plague, and tularemia there. They tested nasty stuff, weaponized anthrax, plague, and smallpox, chaining monkeys and other animals to stakes for open-air explosions to see how everything would spread in the wind. Labs churned out tons of the bacteria, grown in huge vats. When the USSR collapsed, the whole operation got abandoned and left behind. Burial pits ended up being filled with stainless steel drums of live spores just shoved into the ground without proper sealing. Meanwhile, the Aral Sea was shrinking because rivers feeding it had been diverted for irrigation, and by the early 2000s, the island wasn't really an island anymore. It became connected to the mainland by dry seabed, and now there was this fear that rodents would start to move in and potentially carry pathogens out, spreading them to the mainland. US inspection teams in the 90s cracked open pits and found anthrax still kicking after decades underground. Journalists who snuck in also described lab rooms with shattered glass vials and half-buried plague-infected sheep skeletons poking out from the sand. A 2002 cleanup effort bleached over 300 hectares and poured concrete on some of the most contaminated spots. From 1952 to 1989, Rocky Flats near Denver produced the plutonium cores for US nuclear weapons. These were the triggers inside hydrogen bombs. Rocky Flats was one of the most secretive facilities in the country. But in 1989, the FBI raided it. Helicopters circled overhead while agents carried out search warrants. Investigators were looking into illegal waste handling. Allegations included the burning of plutonium-contaminated materials in an incinerator and the improper storage of radioactive waste. Over the years, the site had experienced fires and accidental releases. Contamination had spread beyond the boundaries of the plant in the past, including a major plutonium fire in 1957. Cleanup ultimately cost billions of dollars. By 1996, the plant was shut down permanently, and crews tore down all the 385 buildings. People living in Westminster and Broomfield noticed clusters of leukemia back in the 80s and 90s. And state health records link at least 10 extra cases a year to dust drifting from the site. Every now and then, the wind kicks up tiny traces from spots that never fully got cleaned. The Hanford site in Washington state produced plutonium for the Nagasaki bomb and later supplied material for much of the US nuclear arsenal. Left behind 177 underground tanks holding roughly 56 million gallons of radioactive and chemical waste. Over time, more than 60 have been confirmed to have leaked waste into the ground. Beyond leaks, workers have reported exposure to chemical vapors rising from the tanks. Since the 2010s, dozens of workers have reported symptoms like nosebleeds, breathing issues, and skin irritation. The Department of Energy has acknowledged vapor releases in more recent years, but for a long time, the problem was downplayed, if not just outright ignored. Cleanup at Hanford is one of the most expensive environmental efforts in US history, costing billions of dollars a year. From 1948 to 1958, the US ran 43 nuclear tests around Eniwetok Atoll, blasting islands apart and leaving behind huge piles of radioactive dirt, debris, and bomb parts. In 1979, crews dumped all that mess into a giant crater on Runnet Island, poured a concrete dome over it. There was no waterproof liner underneath, just gravel, so it was basically radioactive sludge sealed under concrete. Problem is, Rising seas have been splashing over the dome every year, slowly cracking it, bringing all that plutonium into the lagoon. Tests found levels that are far too high for drinking water. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres visited in 2019 and called it a coffin, one that's unfortunately leaking. People on nearby islands are also getting extra radiation doses from the leftover fallout. Crabs in the lagoon are so contaminated that people avoid eating them. The Department of Energy admits they never built the dome to handle rising sea levels. Not far from Chernobyl's Reactor 4, there's a place called Rosoka. After the 1986 explosion, hundreds of vehicles used in the immediate response were brought here. Fire trucks that drove in the initial blaze, helicopters that dropped sand and boron over the reactor, armored vehicles that pushed radioactive debris off rooftops. Once they were too contaminated to safely use, they were stripped of salvageable parts and left in rows. Some were later buried in trenches to reduce surface radiation. Throughout the 90s, though, scavengers slipped past patrols. They would torch tires for rubber and haul frames to scrap yards outside the zone. Some of that metal wound up melted into rebar for Kiev apartments and factories. Thankfully, tighter fences and cameras went up in the 2010s. Today, much of the heavy equipment has been dismantled or reburied, but parts of the graveyard still exist in more controlled areas. Excavating it all would kick up a dust cloud of radioactive particles, though, so it mostly just stays sunk where it is, slowly rusting under trees. And with all that said, that's been the video. I will catch you, yes you specifically, next time.